The sun beat down hard on the dusty auction yard that Saturday morning, but John Miller barely felt it. His mind was somewhere else, on his dying cattle, on the empty bank account, on the ranch that was slipping through his fingers like sand. "Lot 17!" The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd. "Edward and Martha Thompson, best animal healers this side of the county." John's heart jumped. This was it, his last shot. He'd heard the stories. Oh yes, folks said this elderly couple had a gift, some kind of way with sick animals that no vet could explain. His herd was dying from something the doctors couldn't figure out, and he was desperate. The kind of desperate that makes a man do things he never thought he would. The old couple stood there on the platform, hands clasped together, looking tired and worn down by life. Martha's grey hair caught the sunlight, and Edward stood tall despite his years, his weathered face showing every hardship he'd ever faced. "Do I hear 500? The auctioneer called out. A wealthy rancher in the front raised his hand, then another. The price climbed higher and higher. John felt sweat trickling down his back, and it wasn't just from the heat. Every dollar they called out was money he didn't have, money he'd have to scrape together somehow. 1,000! Someone shouted. John's hands trembled as he raised his bid card. 1,200! The crowd turned to look at him. He knew what they were thinking. Poor John Miller, barely keeping his head above water, trying to compete with the big ranchers. But he didn't care. He couldn't care. This was about survival. 1,500, the wealthy rancher countered, not even looking back. John closed his eyes for a second. That was everything. Every last cent he had, plus what he could borrow. His voice cracked as he called out, 2,000. Silence fell over the yard. Even the auctioneer seemed surprised. The wealthy rancher shook his head and waved his hand in dismissal. Going once, going twice. The hammer came down with a sharp crack. Sold to John Miller. John's legs nearly gave out. He'd done it. He'd bought them. But as he walked toward the platform to claim his purchase, something strange happened. Martha looked up at him, and her eyes, Lord, those eyes seemed to see right through him. She grabbed Edward's arm, and the old man's face went pale. "You all right?" John asked as he approached. Edward just stared at him, like he'd seen a ghost. We're fine, son." But they weren't fine. John could see it clear as day. Something about him had shaken them to their core, and he had no idea why. As they walked toward his truck, Martha whispered something to Edward that John couldn't quite hear. But he caught one word, just one word, that made his blood run cold. Benjamin. That was his father's name. The father he'd never known. But how could these strangers know that name? And why did John feel like his whole world was about to turn upside down? The old truck rumbled down the dusty road, carrying 3 souls bound together by something none of them understood yet. John gripped the steering wheel, sneaking glances at the elderly couple in the rearview mirror. Edward and Martha sat close together in the back seat, whispering to each other like they were sharing secrets too precious for anyone else to hear. John couldn't make out the words, but he could feel the weight of them, heavy as stones. "You folks know this area?" John asked, trying to break the strange silence that had settled over them. Martha's head snapped up, and she looked out the window with eyes that seemed to recognize every fence post, every turn in the road. No, we don't," she said, but her voice trembled like she was lying. They passed the old Miller's Creek Bridge, the one that had been there since before John was born. Edward leaned forward, his weathered hand gripping the back of John's seat. "That bridge, it's still standing." "Course it is," John said, confused. "Been there 40 years or more, why wouldn't it be?" Edward didn't answer. He just sat back, and John heard him let out a long, shaky breath. The truck climbed the hill toward St. Matthew's Church, that little white building where folks had been praying for generations. The moment it came into view, Martha made a sound, a small, broken sob that cut through the air like a knife. "Mom, you okay back there?" John glanced in the mirror and saw tears streaming down her face. I'm fine, she whispered. But she wasn't fine at all. She was staring at that church like it held every memory she'd ever tried to forget. Edward took her hand, squeezing it tight, and John could see the old man's jaw working like he was fighting back his own tears. What in the world was going on? They drove past the Johnson farm, past the old schoolhouse that had been closed for 20 years, past landmarks John had known his whole life. And with each one, Edward and Martha seemed to sink deeper into themselves like they were drowning in memories. "My ranch is called the Miller's Hope," John said, making conversation as they turned onto the final stretch of road. "Named it that when I bought it 5 years back. Figured every man needs hope, you know." The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife. John looked in the mirror again and saw Edward's face had gone white as a sheet. Martha's hand flew to her mouth and she started crying harder, trying to muffle the sound with her palm. "Folks, what's wrong?" John pulled the truck to the side of the road. "Did I say something?" "No, son." Edward's voice was barely a whisper. "You didn't say nothing wrong. It's just the name of your ranch. What about it?" Martha turned away, pressing her forehead against the window. Edward's eyes, those eyes that John swore he'd seen somewhere before, locked onto his in the rearview mirror. "We used to know people, good people, who lived on land round here long time ago, before everything changed." John's heart started beating faster. "What people?" But Edward just shook his head. "It don't matter now. Ancient history." The truck started moving again, but something had shifted. John felt it in his bones. These weren't just any strangers he'd brought to his ranch. These people knew something. Something about this place. Something about the past. Something, maybe, about him. But what secret were Edward and Martha hiding? And why did every familiar landmark seem to break their hearts a little more? That night, John couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Edward and Martha's strange reactions. But mostly he was thinking about something he tried not to think about too often, his own broken past. See, John Miller hadn't always been John Miller. He'd been found on the steps of St. Matthew's Church 30 years ago, a little boy of 5, crying his heart out. No note, no explanation, nothing but the clothes on his back and a name, Benjamin, that he barely remembered being called. The Millers had taken him in. Good folks, church-going people who gave him a roof over his head and food on his table. But love? Real love? That was something John had always felt was just out of reach, like trying to grab smoke with your bare hands. "You're lucky we took you," Mrs. Miller used to say, not in a mean-spirited way, just as a matter of fact. Not everyone would have done it. And John knew he was lucky. He knew it in his head. But his heart carried a wound that never quite healed, the kind that comes from wondering why your own flesh and blood could just leave you. He'd spent his teenage years asking questions nobody could answer. Who were his real parents? Why did they abandon him? Were they dead? Alive? Did they ever think about him? The Millers didn't talk about it. "Best to let sleeping dogs lie," Mr. Miller would say whenever John brought it up. "You have a family now. That's what matters." But it wasn't enough. Lord knows John tried to make it enough, but that hole inside him just kept growing, getting bigger and bigger, until some days he felt like he might fall right into it and never climb out. He'd searched every record he could find, asked every old-timer in the county, visited that church 100 times, hoping someone, anyone, would remember something about the day he was left there. Nothing. Just dead ends and closed doors. So John had learned to live with it, that constant ache of not knowing, of feeling like half a person, like a book with the first chapters torn out. He'd built his life anyway, bought this ranch, and named it Miller's Hope, because he needed to believe that hope was still possible, even for someone like him. But now, lying there in the dark, listening to the old house settling around him, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something big. Those people downstairs in the guest room, Edward and Martha, they knew something. The way they'd reacted to the church, to the name of his ranch, to every landmark on that road, it wasn't a coincidence. And that name Martha had whispered at the auction. Benjamin. His name. His real name. John's hands trembled as he pressed them against his eyes. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "if you're listening, if you've got answers for me after all these years, please, I'm ready. I've been ready my whole life." He didn't know it then, but his prayer was about to be answered in the most impossible, heartbreaking, miraculous way imaginable. Downstairs in the guest room, Martha was crying softly while Edward held her. "It's him," she kept whispering. "Oh God, Edward, it's really him. our boy, our Benjamin. But how could John possibly be their son? And what terrible circumstances had torn this family apart 30 years ago? The morning sun hadn't even cleared the horizon when John heard Edward and Martha already out in the barn. He pulled on his boots and headed out, coffee mug in hand, wondering what in the world they were doing up so early. What he found stopped him dead in his tracks. Edward was kneeling beside Daisy, the sickest cow in the herd, the one Dr. Robert had said probably wouldn't make it through the week. The old man's weathered hands were pressed gently against her side, and he was whispering something John couldn't quite hear. Martha stood nearby, mixing some kind of paste from herbs John didn't recognize. "What are you doing?" John asked, stepping closer. "Healing," Edward said simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "This girl's got an infection deep in her gut. The medicine your vet gave her isn't reaching it." "How do you know that?" John's voice came out sharper than he meant it to. "Dr. Robert's the best vet in 3 counties. Martha looked up at him with those eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. "Some things, honey, you just know. You feel it." Within 3 days, Daisy was standing. Within a week, she was eating again. Dr. Robert came by to check on her and nearly fell over when he saw her walking around the pasture like nothing had ever been wrong. "I don't understand it," the vet said, scratching his head. "This doesn't make any medical sense. What did you do?" "We just helped her along," Edward said quietly. Dr. Robert's eyes narrowed. John could see the mix of amazement and something else in the vet's face. Jealousy, maybe, or wounded pride. Here was a man who'd spent years studying animal medicine, and these 2 old folks were doing things he couldn't explain. But it wasn't just Daisy. One by one, Edward and Martha worked through the sick animals, and here's the thing that really got to John. Edward seemed to know each animal by name, even though John had never told him what they were called. "Easy there, Buck," Edward would say to the stubborn old bull. "I know you're hurting, but you have to let me help you." "How do you know his name?" John asked, his heart starting to beat faster. Edward paused, his hand still on Buck's massive head. I guess you must have mentioned it." But John knew he hadn't. He was sure of it. Then there was the pregnant mare, a beautiful chestnut named Lady, who was due any day now. Martha spent hours with that horse, brushing her coat, talking to her in soft whispers, crying sometimes for no reason John could understand. "You act like you know that horse," John said one evening, watching Martha press her forehead against Lady's neck. Martha's voice broke when she answered. "She reminds me of someone I used to know, someone I lost a long time ago." The way she said it, the pain in her voice, it was the kind of grief that comes from losing family, not just a horse. John stood there in the barn, watching these 2 old people work with his animals like they'd been doing it their whole lives, like they belonged here, like they'd come home. And suddenly, terribly, John understood something he wasn't ready to understand. These people weren't just good with animals. They loved these animals the way you love something that's part of you, part of your blood, part of your history. But why would 2 strangers love his animals like their own family? What connection bound them to this ranch that John himself didn't understand? It was early morning when John went looking for Edward to ask about the feed schedule. He checked the barn, the house, the equipment shed. Nowhere. Then he saw him, way up on Miller's Ridge, that little hilltop overlooking the whole ranch. John climbed up slowly, his boots crunching on the dry grass. As he got closer, he could hear Edward's voice, broken and trembling, lifted up in prayer. "Lord, forgive me. Forgive me for what I did. I know I don't deserve to be here, don't deserve to see him again, but thank you. Oh God, thank you for this chance." John froze. Edward was kneeling in the exact same spot where John used to play as a little boy, where the Millers said they'd found his favorite toy truck buried in the dirt. How could Edward know about this place? That evening, John sat at the kitchen table doing paperwork while Martha prepared dinner. She was humming, just a simple tune, nothing special, but the moment John heard it, his whole body went cold. He knew that melody. Deep in his bones, he knew it. What song is that?" His voice came out barely a whisper. Martha's hands stilled over the pot she was stirring. "Oh, just an old lullaby. My mama used to sing it to me." "Sing the words," John said, his heart pounding. "Please." Martha's voice shook as she sang, "Hush now, my darling, don't you cry. Mama's going to sing you a lullaby. When the morning comes, you'll see. You're the greatest gift God gave to me." John's chair scraped back so hard it nearly fell over. Mrs. Miller, his adoptive mother, had told him once that his real mother used to sing him a lullaby, those exact words. She'd heard it from a neighbor who'd known his birth parents back before everything. "Where'd you learn that song?" John demanded, his voice cracking. I told you, my mama..." "Don't lie to me." John's hands were shaking. "That song, my mother used to sing that song. My real mother." Martha turned away, tears streaming down her face, but she said nothing. The next day, Dr. Roberts stopped by to check on the herd. He stood watching Edward work with the animals, a strange look on his face. "You know," the vet said to John, "that old man knows things about this ranch that even you don't know. He told me about the flood of '95, how the old barn used to sit 20 feet east of where it is now. How would he know that?" "The flood of '95? John's mind raced. "That was 30 years ago. I was just a kid." "Exactly," Dr. Roberts said quietly. "Only locals would have remembered that, folks who lived here back then." That afternoon, old Mr. Patterson from the neighboring ranch came by to drop off some tools he'd borrowed. He stopped dead when he saw Edward fixing the fence line. "I'll be..." Mr. Patterson whispered, squinting at Edward. "That old man's got a familiar way about him. Something about how he moves, how he holds himself. I swear I've seen him before, long time ago." "You know him?" John asked, hope and fear warring in his chest. "Can't place it," Mr. Patterson scratched his head. "But I know that face. I'd bet money on it." That night, John couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. Every conversation, every strange moment, every impossible coincidence, they were all adding up to something his mind couldn't quite accept. The hilltop where he played as a child. The lullaby his mother sang. Stories only locals would know. A face someone recognized from 30 years ago. The pieces were there, scattered like puzzle pieces on a table. But John was terrified, absolutely terrified, of what picture they'd make when he finally put them together. What truth was hiding in plain sight? And was John ready to face a revelation that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his life? John was reorganizing the medicine shelf in the barn when his hand brushed against something that didn't belong there, an old tin box pushed way back behind bottles of antibiotics and wound spray. He pulled it out, his fingers tracing the rusted edges. It wasn't his. He'd never seen it before. Someone must have put it there recently. His heart already knew. Somehow, his heart already knew what he was going to find. The lid creaked open, and there it was. A photograph, faded and worn, the edges soft from being handled too many times over too many years. A little boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with a gap-toothed smile and dirt on his cheeks, standing between a young couple, a man with kind eyes and work-worn hands, a woman with long dark hair and a smile that could light up the world. John's hands started shaking so bad he nearly dropped the picture. Because he knew that little boy. He knew those eyes, that smile, that cowlick that never would stay down, no matter how much his mama, his adoptive mama, tried to smooth it. That little boy was him. But the couple, Lord have mercy, the couple standing beside him. John stumbled out of the barn, the photograph clutched in his fist. He found Edward and Martha in the garden, tending to the vegetables like they didn't have a care in the world. "Where did you get this?" John's voice came out raw, broken. He held up the photograph with a trembling hand. "Where did you get this picture?" Martha's face went white as a sheet. Edward closed his eyes like he was in pain. "John," Edward started. "Don't." John cut him off. "Don't you dare lie to me. This is me in this picture. This is me when I was a little boy, and you... He couldn't finish, couldn't say what his mind was screaming at him. Martha was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered face. "We can explain..." "Explain what?" John's voice broke. "Explain why you have a picture of me from 30 years ago. Explain why you look at this ranch like you've lived here before. Explain why you know things only my parents would know." The word hung in the air between them. Parents. "We were going to tell you," Edward said quietly. his voice thick with emotion. We didn't know how. Tell me what? But John already knew. God help him, he already knew. Edward's eyes, those eyes John had sworn he'd seen before, filled with tears. That picture was taken the summer before we had to leave you, before everything fell apart. The world tilted. John's knees went weak, and he had to grab the fence post to keep from falling. No, he whispered. No, that can't be. We're your parents, son, Martha said, her voice breaking on every word. We're the ones who left you at that church 30 years ago. The photograph slipped from John's fingers, floating down to the dirt like a feather. Everything he thought he knew, everything he'd built his life on, crumbled in that single moment. These people, these strangers he'd bought at an auction, were his mother and father, the parents who'd abandoned him, the parents he'd spent his whole life searching for. They'd been here all along, right here in front of him, and he hadn't even known. But why? Why had they left him? And how could fate have brought them back together in the cruelest, most impossible way imaginable? They sat at the kitchen table, John on one side, Edward and Martha on the other, with 30 years of silence between them, thick as fog. Tell me everything, John said, his voice hollow. I deserve to know everything. Edward's weathered hands shook as he reached across the table, but John pulled back. The old man's face crumpled, but he nodded, understanding. We were so poor, Edward began, his voice breaking. So desperately poor. This ranch, Miller's Hope, it was ours once. We called it Thompson's Dream back then. John's breath caught. His ranch, their ranch. We had 3 cows, a few chickens, and you, Martha whispered, tears streaming down her face. You were our whole world, Benjamin, our beautiful boy. Then the drought came, Edward continued. Lasted 3 years. The animals died one by one. We sold everything, the furniture, tools, Martha's wedding ring, but it wasn't enough. We were starving, son. Literally starving. Martha's voice was barely audible. You were so thin, baby, so thin. You'd cry from hunger, and we had nothing to give you. So you left me, John said flatly. You just left me at a church and walked away. We prayed, Edward said, his face wet with tears. We prayed that someone with food, with money, with a real home would find you. We prayed you'd have the life we couldn't give you. You prayed. John's voice rose. You prayed and then you abandoned a 5-year-old child. We died that day too, Martha cried out. You think we lived after that? We were walking dead, Benjamin, walking dead. Edward's shoulders shook with sobs. We left you at St. Matthew's because we knew the Millers went to service there every Sunday. Good people. People who could feed you, clothe you, give you everything we couldn't. We stayed in the area, Martha said, working whatever jobs we could find, always hoping, always searching. We asked everyone if they'd seen a little boy named Benjamin, checked every school, every park, every church. But you'd been renamed John Miller, Edward said. And the Millers, they were protective. They didn't talk about your past to nobody. John felt like he was drowning. All these years, you were looking for me. Every single day, Martha whispered. Every single day for 30 years. The cruelty of it hit John like a punch to the gut. They'd spent 3 decades searching for him, and then, by some twisted hand of fate, he'd bought them at an auction. His own parents, and neither of them had known. When I saw you at that auction, Edward's voice cracked, when you said your name was John Miller, I looked in your eyes, and I knew. Lord help me, I knew those eyes. They were your mama's eyes. We thought we were losing our minds, Martha said. How could our Benjamin be buying us? How could God be that cruel and that merciful at the same time? John stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, his whole body trembling. You worked with my animals like you loved them, he said, his back to them. Why? Because they're all we had left of this place, Edward said quietly. That pregnant mare, Lady, she's descended from our last horse. We recognized her bloodline the moment we saw her. The animals were our family when we lost you, Martha added. They were all we had. John pressed his forehead against the cool glass, feeling like his heart was being torn in two. But even as the devastating truth came to light, a deeper mystery remained, one that would transform their suffering into something miraculous. The days that followed felt like walking through broken glass. Every step hurt, every moment cut deeper. John couldn't look at Edward and Martha without feeling his chest tighten, half with rage for the little boy who'd cried himself to sleep every night, wondering why he wasn't good enough to keep, and half with heartbreak for two people who'd clearly suffered just as much. How do you hate someone and love them at the same time? How do you forgive the unforgivable? He'd wake up at 3 in the morning, his pillow wet with tears he didn't remember crying. Downstairs he could hear Martha sobbing too, those quiet, broken sounds of a mother who'd lost her child twice, once by choice, once by fate. Edward still worked the ranch, but now there was a distance between them that felt wider than the 30 years they'd been apart. John would hand him tools without a word. Edward would take them without meeting his eyes. "Thank you," Edward would whisper each time, like he was thanking John for more than just a wrench or a hammer, like he was thanking him for not sending them away. But John didn't know what to do with them. They were his employees. He'd bought them, paid money for them, but they were also his parents, his blood, his family. How do you pay a salary to your own mother? How do you give orders to your father? Dr. Robert noticed something was wrong the minute he stepped onto the ranch. The tension was so thick you could choke on it. "What happened here?" the vet asked, watching John and Edward work on opposite sides of the barn, moving around each other like strangers. "It's complicated," John said, his voice rough. Dr. Robert studied him for a long moment. "Son, I've been a vet for 30 years. You know what I've learned? Pain that ain't released just poisons everything around it. Animals, people, the land itself, it all feels it." "Some pain can't be released," John said bitterly. "Some wounds don't heal." "That's where you're wrong," Dr. Robert said gently. "Every wound can heal. Question is, are you willing to let it?" But John didn't have an answer. Then the animals started getting sick again. Not all of them, just a few at first. Daisy, who'd been healthy for weeks, stopped eating. Buck, the old bull, became listless. Even Lady, the pregnant mare, seemed distressed, pacing her stall at night. Edward tried his healing methods, but nothing worked. Martha's herbs and remedies had no effect. It was like the animals had given up, like they'd absorbed the family's pain and couldn't carry it anymore. "I don't understand," Edward said, his voice breaking as he knelt beside Daisy. "This ain't a sickness of the body, this is something else." Dr. Robert examined the animals and shook his head. "Their vitals are fine. Blood works normal, but they're fading anyway, like they've lost the will to live." That night, John stood in the barn, watching Lady pace restlessly. The mare's eyes were wide with anxiety, her body trembling. "I know, girl," John whispered, pressing his forehead against her neck. "I know you feel it too. All this anger, all this hurt. It's poisoning everything, isn't it?" Behind him he heard footsteps. Edward stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the barn floor. "The animals," Edward said quietly. "They're showing us what we can't see ourselves. The unforgiveness, the bitterness. It's killing more than just us, son. It's killing everything we love." John's hands clenched into fists. "Don't call me son." "But you are," Edward's voice broke. "You're my son. And I'm sorry. Lord knows I'm sorry. But hate won't heal nothing. It'll just destroy what little we got left." As the ranch fell deeper into crisis, John faced an impossible choice: hold on to his pain or find the courage to forgive the unforgivable. It happened on a cold Tuesday morning, the kind where your breath comes out in clouds and the ground crunches under your boots. Lady, the pregnant mare, went into labor. John found Martha already in the stall, her weathered hands gentle on the horse's trembling side. "She's struggling," Martha whispered, tears in her eyes. "The foal's breech." "I'll get Edward," John said, but Martha grabbed his arm. "No, we need to do this together, all three of us." John's heart clenched, but he nodded. Minutes later, Edward joined them, and for the first time in weeks they worked side by side without the wall of anger between them. "Easy, girl," Edward murmured to Lady. "We're here. We got you." And that's when John saw it. The way Lady's eyes softened when she heard Edward's voice. The way she turned her head toward Martha like she was seeking comfort from an old friend. "She knows you," John whispered. "She really knows you." "Her great-grandmother was ours," Martha said softly. "Last foal born before we lost everything. Lady carries that bloodline, that memory in her bones. They worked for hours, the three of them, their hands moving together to guide new life into the world. And when the foal finally slipped free, wet and trembling but breathing, something broke open in John's chest. "She's beautiful," he breathed, watching the tiny creature struggle to stand. "Just like you were," Martha whispered. And when John looked at her, really looked at her, he saw his mother, not the woman who'd abandoned him, but the woman who'd made an impossible choice to save him. The next morning, they found an orphaned calf near the south fence. Its mother had died during the night, and the little thing was crying, weak and alone. John carried it to the barn, and without thinking, he called out, "Mom, Dad, I need help." The words were out before he could stop them. "Mom, Dad." Edward and Martha froze. Then Martha's face crumpled, and she ran to him, her hands reaching for the calf, but her eyes on John. "What do we do?" John asked, his voice breaking on the word, "we." For the next 3 days, they took turns bottle feeding that calf every 2 hours. In the dark of night, exhausted and covered in hay, they sat together in the barn, a family brought back together by a creature that needed them. Dr. Robert came by and found all three of them asleep, John's head on Martha's shoulder, Edward's hand resting on John's back, the calf curled up between them. "Well, I'll be," the vet whispered. Then he saw the other animals, Daisy standing strong, Buck alert and healthy, Lady nuzzling her new foal. It hit him then, the truth he'd been missing all along. It wasn't medicine, Dr. Robert said aloud to the empty barn. It was never about medicine. It was always about love. Edward and Martha's gift wasn't in their herbs or their methods. It was in the love they poured into everything they touched, a love so pure, so desperate to make up for lost time, that even the animals felt it and responded. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, John finally spoke the words that had been trapped in his throat for weeks. "I forgive you." Martha's sob was so powerful it shook her whole body. Edward covered his face with his hands. "I don't understand it yet," John continued, his voice trembling, "and it still hurts, but I forgive you because holding on to this hate, it's killing us all." Edward reached out, and this time John didn't pull away. But even this miracle of forgiveness was only the beginning. The greatest transformation was yet to come. 6 months later, Miller's hope looked different. Not just the fresh paint on the barn or the new fences, it was the feeling of the place. The air itself seemed lighter, like the land had been holding its breath for 30 years and finally exhaled. John stood on the porch with Edward and Martha, watching the sun rise over the hills. His parents. The words still felt strange on his tongue, but they were getting easier every day. "I got something for you," John said, pulling papers from his pocket. His hands trembled just a little. Edward took them, squinting at the legal documents. His eyes went wide. "John, this is adoption papers," John finished. "You gave me up once to save my life. Now I'm adopting you back. Officially, legally. You're my parents, and I want the whole world to know it." Martha's sob echoed across the ranch. Edward pulled John into his arms, and this time, John held on tight. "Thompson Miller," John said. "That's our new family name. Your past and my present, together." The ranch had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. It started with the orphaned calf, then an abandoned dog someone left at their gate, then a horse too old to work, a goat with a broken leg, chickens nobody wanted. "We can't turn them away," Martha had said. "We know what it's like to be unwanted." Dr. Robert came by so often, he eventually moved his practice to the ranch. "You folks are doing something special here," he said. "Healing animals and healing hearts, it's all the same work." Word spread. People started bringing their wounded animals, yes, but they brought their wounded hearts too. A widow who'd lost her husband, a father estranged from his daughter, a young couple on the verge of divorce. They'd sit in the barn helping feed the animals, and somehow, in the quiet work of caring for broken creatures, they'd start to heal themselves. One Sunday, John stood before the church and told their story. All of it. The abandonment, the searching, the impossible reunion, the forgiveness. There wasn't a dry eye in that sanctuary. "God used the animals to save us," John said, his voice strong despite the tears on his face. "He used wounded creatures to heal the most broken hearts, because that's what love does. It finds a way. Always. After the service, an old man approached them, crying. "I haven't spoken to my son in 15 years, he whispered. "But if you three can find your way back to each other, maybe we can too." That became the legacy of Miller's Hope, a place where lost things were found, where broken things were mended, where families torn apart by life's cruelty could learn to love again. Lady's foal grew strong and beautiful. They named her Hope, and she became the symbol of everything the ranch stood for. Every time someone visited and saw that young horse running free, they remembered that new life can come from the darkest nights. On the 1-year anniversary of that fateful auction, the three of them stood together on Miller's Ridge, the same spot where Edward had prayed that first morning. "Thank you," Edward whispered to the sky. "Thank you for bringing him back to us." "Thank you," Martha echoed. "For giving us a second chance." John wrapped his arms around both of them. "Thank you," he said, "for showing me that it's never too late. Never too late to forgive. Never too late to love. Never too late to come home." And so, through the mystery of God's perfect timing, a poor farmer who bought an elderly couple without knowing they were his parents discovered the greatest miracle of all, that true love will always, always find its way back home.